Today is December 19th, 2018. My name is Leah Cohen, and on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, I'm pleased to interview Mason Holmes. He was an Army accounting specialist and served in Phu Vinh Army Base in Vietnam, which is about 70 kilometers northwest of Bien Ho. So welcome.
Benoit. That's
Benoit.
okay.
Benoit.
That's
So
okay.
it's Benoit.
Okay. Glad to be here.
Glad to be here. So we'll start a little bit with your background. Where and when were you born?
I was born in 1948 in Buffalo, New York. My parents were older than other parents. My father was a college grad, as was my mother. He worked as a sales engineer. She had been with NBC during World War II. So I grew up basically in a middle-class neighborhood, suburb of Buffalo. Went through public school, went into high school, and with the other members of my class, graduated in 1965 from high school. So I was in the top 2% of my high school class.
Wow.
And as with many other both regular graduates and honor graduates, we were aimed toward getting college educations, with only a very small group who would go into the military. Some did go to technical training schools, others went to trade schools, and I'd say half of our class or more went to college.
Were your parents also encouraging you to go to college, and that they themselves were
Yes, they did.
college
Yes,
graduates?
yes,
Yeah.
they did. My mother, in fact, was a honors graduate at Duke University, and I was introduced to that college at her 25th college reunion when I was about 12 years old, and so I wanted to go there, and I ended up getting admitted to Duke University in the fall of 1965.
Did you have any siblings?
Yes, I have a younger sister, born in late 1949. She, unlike myself, I was in very good in mathematics, science, and history. She was very good in English and the arts. So she was an artistic type, and she ended up going to junior college, and then later on graduated from a four-year college. Then, while over in England, she ended up getting a master's degree in art history. So very educated family, I guess.
Yeah, no, I was impressed that both your parents, that your mother in
Yeah,
particular, had
sure.
been a college
Yes,
student.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
What were some of the activities that you were involved in while you were in high school?
Well, I was with on the advertising staff of the yearbook, and trying to think, advertising and business staff of the newspaper. I was on the tennis team. I sometimes played intramural sports, and was generally, I guess, a little bit of the business background that I'd further study, and the tennis, which I've kept up as a lifelong activity.
Lifelong,
Yes.
yeah, things that you kept up. Yeah. Um, did your family talk about current events? You'd mentioned that your father would have been too old for World War II, but too young for World War I, although
Yes.
I believe you mentioned he had served in the St. Louis Guard. Do you want to talk about
Yes.
that a little bit?
Yes. During the 1920s, he served with the Missouri Air Guard out of St. Louis, and one of the highlights was that he was training to be an aerial photographer, and one of his trips up into a biplane was in the back seat of Captain Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh, who flew across the channel, flew across to Europe on the transatlantic crossing, and he was in the unit during the time that occurred. So it was quite a momentous event. In fact, I think I have a picture, a very small picture of him standing next to Charles Lindbergh.
Oh my goodness. So
Yeah.
was he doing aerial photography in the biplane when there was the flight over the
No, he didn't do any of he didn't do any of that preparation. No, no. So his connection with the military was that, and my mother had an interesting connection with a military figure, in that when she was with NBC in New York, World War II, they had a big homecoming after the peace was signed with Japan, and Colonel Paul Tibbets was one of the VIPs who she met. And his his being one of the people who was responsible for helping to end the war with Japan is going to come up later in my history.
Wow. What was your mother's role in NBC at the time?
I'm not really sure. I know she did some public relations work, and she also authored some telegram that went out to the NBC affiliates at the end of World War II, citing the war is finally over and now we can get back to peacetime activities, and hopefully we'll live in a world that will live at peace for a while.
Yeah. Wow. So you mentioned that you had wanted to go to Duke University after being introduced to it at your mother's reunion of 25 years. So what did you major when in college?
Well, when I got in, I was looking to be pre-law, but then I was in with a bunch of English and history majors, some of whom were brighter than I was, so I switched over to business administration and accounting, finance, those sorts of things. But I still was interested in history, and I considered that my minor subject. So business was major and um, history was minor.
You mentioned too that you were following the news on a
Yes.
daily basis. So what was your understanding of what was going on in Vietnam while you were still in college?
Well, during the 65 to 69 timeframe was when there were a lot of reporters on the ground in Vietnam talking to the troops, and we also sometimes listened in on what were called the famous 5 o'clock follies when the senior military leaders would get up, give their assessment of the war. And I followed not only the TV accounts, radio accounts, also newspaper and magazine accounts. So I would read local and national newspapers. I read Newsweek magazine, Time magazine once in a while. So I would try to keep up to date on the political, military, and other issues that were surrounding the war.
And you mentioned like some of your impressions. Do you want to talk about your opinion of the domino theory at the time?
Well, at the time, yes, I listened to the domino theory as espoused by the military and political leaders, the idea that if the communists got a stronghold in Indochina, that pretty soon the dominoes would fall and they would be on the doorstep of Australia. And that was sort of taught to us during the time we were growing up during the Cold War about the communists wanting to take over the world, and the between Khrushchev and all of the other leaders who said we're going to bury you, and not necessarily us in the United States, but democracies in other parts of the world.
You mentioned as well that while in high school, many of the teachers were World War II or Korean War veterans. Did that influence your
Not a lot,
attitude?
because
Yeah.
they really didn't talk about any of their war stories. There was one print shop teacher who one of the guys asked him, "Well, where'd you get that big scar on your hand?" He said, "Oh, well, that was a Japanese soldier in World War II." And of course, the Japanese soldier got killed and he lived and he went on to teach. So I would say that basically the majority of World War II veterans didn't talk about their service much at all because there were so many who served, and you were the exception if you didn't serve. So it was like everybody was in that together, and including the people who were back home working in the factories, the Rosie the Riveter
Yeah.
type folks, etc. Yeah, yeah.
Well, but you mentioned that you saw the strife within the country. So you said it wasn't only a war against communism and democracy, but you saw it a bit like a civil war within the United States. Could you elaborate, please?
Well, the sort of not civil war, but the differences of opinion in the United States were that the World War II vets were telling their sons, well, if your country calls, you go, no matter what the situation. And of course, everybody believed that after World War II, when the communists built up their stronghold in Eastern Europe, that okay, once they start into Southeast Asia, it's only a matter of time before they take over other countries, and we have to stop them there. So we were taught a lot of that during junior high, I'd say in high school. And of course, we had the famous duck and cover drills during elementary and early junior high school. And oddly enough, the high school I went to was located north of Buffalo and south of Niagara Falls, and there was
Oh,
a major crossroads, two highways that met, which would have been a terrific aiming point for a 100 megaton bomb in which we'd be vaporized in a millionth of a second. So after a while, just sort of say, well, so what?
so what?
Yeah,
I believe
big
there
deal.
was also a Nike missile site
Yeah, there were Nike
there,
missile
missile
sites
sites, right?
around
They
near
were there.
Fort Niagara. Yeah, there were those missile sites in case we had to defend ourselves.
Sounds right.
Yeah.
What was your impression of the all the protests going on when you were at college, like in late 68, 69-ish? What was your impression of the student protests to
Well,
the
I
war?
think they had a legitimate gripe that we were in a war that by that time the number of troops in Vietnam were over 500,000, and there seemed to be no end in sight. And of course, for some of the students, the male students especially, the fear was, well, I'm going to get called on, and I'm going to be another piece of cannon fodder and go over and have to fight this war that it doesn't seem that A, we're winning, or B, that's necessary. So um, I I didn't support the protests as such, but I wasn't anti-protest. I believe that everybody has a right to say what they believe, and that's part of our Constitution.
Were you affected by the Tet Offensive, or I mean, I know you were still in the States, but was your thinking affected by events in Vietnam, such as the Tet Offensive?
Well, it was partly the Tet Offensive and the images that shone on the TV. They had the one where the district officer of Saigon, the general, went and executed the Viet Cong on the street. And later on, many years later, I learned that what happened was this Viet Cong had killed some of his colleagues and their families. And that was one thing that didn't get reported. And one thing that I learned many, many years later, that there were atrocities on both sides. And it seemed like the atrocities by the other side got very well covered up by the enemy. But going back to watching during college, I think I was more uh, affected not so much by the Tet Offensive, which was a huge surprise, and that was when obviously a lot of people turned against the war, was because we'd been learning had been going so well, and then all of a sudden there's a surprise attack. But also the siege at Khe Sanh, that was a long 77-day siege that lasted into March 1968. And in fact, all through 1968, there were some major battles. So it just looked as if we were not being told the whole truth by the generals and the military hierarchy, as we found out later through some of those taped conversations between the military, LBJ, and Richard Nixon. So,
Yeah. So were you? Do you want to describe why and how you decided to enlist to
mhm.
the army?
Well, just before we go into that, I'd like
Sure,
to
sure.
give a little story about when I was at Duke University. One of the courses I enrolled in was taught by a very well-known military historian, Dr. Theodore Ropp, and I had been in his world history courses as a freshman, and then as a senior, I was in a course called Military History and Elementary Strategy, and we invited from time to time guest speakers to talk to the class.
Hmm.
Well, one of the guest speakers happened to be a former general from the naval forces of Japan, Minoru Genda, General Minoru Genda, who, as a commander, was the one who planned the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. So, in
Oh my
going
goodness.
backwards, while I had met the man who was generally um, largely responsible for getting us into the war with Japan, my mother met the man who was largely responsible for ending the war with Japan. So there was that juxtaposition that I didn't think of until many years later. So,
My
okay.
goodness.
So, and then I guess we can go into in spring of my senior year at Duke. Um, our, I was under the Buffalo Draft Board where I grew up, and many of the young men who were the working class guys worked in factories, etc., were getting drafted, and a lot of the college guys were sort of slipping through the net. So the draft board sent me a postcard in March of '69 that said, "Dear Mr. Holmes, we understand you're graduating, and what day are you graduating?"
Mm.
So I just casually wrote back, said, "Well, I'm graduating June the 2nd." So then I got home June the 3rd, and already there was a letter there that said, "Greeting, you are now 1A." So
Do you want to explain for
yeah,
our viewers what 1A means?
1A means
Yeah.
that you're ready for active duty. And during my last semester at Duke, knowing I'd likely be drafted at some point or another, I looked into alternative services. Well, my eyes weren't good enough to join the Air Force, and I didn't really want to go in the Marines. And one of the areas which I was really interested in, given my business background, was going into the Naval Supply Corps officer program. So I went to a recruiter on campus, and he said, "Okay, I understand you're interested in the program." And he said, "So what is your GPA?" And I said, "Well, it's 2 plus something." And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we only take people with a 3.4 GPA." And I said, "Well, what about the quality of the school? And the fact I'm one of the
Yeah.
toughest schools in the U.S." And
Yeah.
he said, "Well, it doesn't matter. We just have this we have this target that if you're not there, you're not there." So I'd also checked out for a brief time, joining up into the Merchant Marine, but then I found out that the Merchant Marine does not excuse you from regular military service or the draft.
Oh my
So
goodness.
I knew I would be going within about 6 months once I got the greetings, the reclassification to 1A, lost my student deferment. So what I did was I basically went to draft board and said, "Well, my plan is after I get out of the service is to go to graduate school, get a graduate degree in business or something else. And so if you want to take me, since you're going to take me anyway, why don't you take me with the next draft call?" So I was inducted in September of '69 with at the Buffalo draft board, not draft board, but the
Yeah.
reception center. We had about 15 men who were in that day. 13 of us were drafted into the Army. One was drafted into the Marines to his big surprise. And another one refused to step forward, whom I later learned was in my younger sister's high school class.
Yeah.
Now, the composition of these men who were drafted out of Buffalo, many of us were college graduates. There was one who had been in the Peace Corps, one who was a second year law student at the University of Buffalo, and others who were very well educated. So they went ahead and they grabbed us to go ahead and send along to basic training.
Wow. So were you considering other options like becoming a conscientious objector, being so close to Canada, Buffalo being so close to
Well, that's a
Canada?
very good observation because were some people who skipped off to Canada, not only from, say, New York State, but elsewhere. And I never thought of being a conscientious objector. I decided, well, I'll take my chances with the military. We'll see what happens and go from there. So I never gave it a thought. So even though I was only, say, 10 miles uh, from the bridge, Rainbow Bridge, going over into Canada, the Peace Bridge, rather, going over into Canada, I didn't think about that.
And what did your family think about you joining the army?
Well, I have to say that there was a period before then where my father had actually encouraged me to join the Army. And I'll kind of go back a couple of years in my college education was that after my sophomore year and hitting a sophomore slump and failing several classes, at the end of that year, I did not have the grades to go into my junior year. So at that point in time, my father and mother argued about it. My father said, "Well, the best thing for Mason to do is to go in the Army, grow up, and then maybe he can go back to college." Well, my mother saw what was going on in Vietnam, and I sort of knew what was going on in Vietnam, big buildup of troops. I said, "Well, I'm not really too keen on that idea." And my mother's sister, my aunt, came forward, loaned me the money that would be both to support my summer school to get my grades up and what I would have earned working in the factory during the summer. So she bailed me out, and I was lucky enough to get the grades sufficient to go on to my junior year. So that was an area where my father was suggesting I go in as a 19-year-old, and had I gone in mid 1967, I would have probably gotten out of AI basic training, the initial 8 weeks plus maybe 8 weeks of advanced training or AIT, and then I would have been over in Vietnam in time for the Tet Offensive. So that would not have been great. So luckily, I continued my career
Yeah.
in at Duke and was able to finish my 4-year degree.
Wow. Wow. So I think you mentioned these 15 men who
Yeah.
were drafted the same
Yes.
time as you, many of which were college
Right.
graduates. Did you know other ones from high school in addition to the classmate of your sister? Or
Well, there were a couple of guys in my high school, one who went into the Marines. A few, I think, when they went to college, might have gone into ROTC, but we sort of dispersed from high school, and I didn't really follow the backgrounds of other high school graduates until a little later on. And in fact, in basic training, I met a guy who was in from my high school from the graduated the year before I did. So that was just a happenstance, and I hadn't known him in high school. So mostly I went in to the service with strangers. I didn't sign up with a buddy or anything like that, as I've heard some people do.
um, and how long was it from your induction until the time you were sent to basic training?
Okay, what happened was we were inducted. Actually, we took the oath on Friday. I think it was September 5th, but we only were really in the military starting Monday was when the plane left to go to Fort Dix, New Jersey. So we left on a plane, and September 8th, 1969 was my actual first day of active military duty. And then we had what was the 0 week, in which we were taking aptitude tests and intelligence tests. So I scored very well, apparently, on the verbal and math tests. And on some of the aptitude tests, it was really amusing that they had a question on one of these things about being outdoors. I like long walks in the woods. Well, that I immediately labeled false because I didn't like long walks, and I didn't think I was cut out to be an infantryman. So it was one of those amusing things, and
Because I'll
we,
pass on that
yeah,
one.
right, yeah, yeah. So we took everything from I mean, I even gave a little language test, see if you could learn new languages, and we had a gentleman from our basic training company went out to the language school at Monterey,
Hmm.
and then they were Morse code tests and some other technical tests for people who might be mechanics or work as electricians, whatever the trades type thing was. And then, so during that week, and here was another interesting incident of our getting into basic was we were all lined up to go into the mess hall for lunch, and a drill sergeant was counting off people. We were lined up in groups of four, and he went for it. And then he stopped about 2 rows behind me, and he said to us up front, he said, "Well, you guys are really lucky." And I asked him, "Well, why are we lucky, drill
Yeah.
sergeant?" He said, "Well, these guys back here are going down to Fort Jackson for their basic training. The Fort Dix had so many people come in that they couldn't handle all the trainees." So I was thinking, okay, the vast majority of men who were assigned basic training or went into Fort Dix were guys from the urban areas of the Northeast cities, New York State, Pennsylvania, etc., New England, and several of these people were minorities. And I thought, well, how are they going to deal with some of these Southern drill instructors who might be just a little bit biased? and, and there was still a lot of racial bias down in the South, even in mid to late 60s. I saw that when I was going to school, and not on the campus, but as I went around, I went on a couple bus trips, and in these small towns, they had some signs up that said, "Okay, whites only, colored here for,"
Hmm.
just really, something. So that was my introduction, the so-called 0 week. Then we started in getting assigned to our units. I was in E Company, uh, second, fifth battalion, second basic combat training brigade, and I believe there were a couple full brigades or more during the time I got in there. Probably 12, 15,000, X thousands of people at basic training, and those who are permanent party at Fort Dix. Now, the composition of our basic training company was rather interesting, as I learned through the 8 weeks, was that out of the 5 platoons, the first platoon primarily had the young men who were offered the alternative. They stood before a judge and were offered the alternative of either going to jail because they'd been juvenile delinquents or going in the Army. So we got one of those. The first platoon, in fact, went AWOL 9 times in 8 weeks. So those are the type in the first platoon. Then the second platoon were largely, excuse me, I got to take a
Sure.
drink here. Second platoon were guys who were high school graduates. Third platoon were guys who might have had some um, junior college. Fourth platoon, somewhat more educated. And fifth platoon that I was in were all college graduates, National Guard, reserves, etc. Men who were, some who had graduate degrees. And in fact, one of the gentlemen who showed up at basic was a 25-year-old German national. And the drill sergeant said, "Well, what are you doing here? You've got a suit on and you're carrying a briefcase." And the guy said, "Well, I'd like to become a United States citizen." So I signed up to help me in my application. So, yeah, so we got all types in our basic training.
Did you find the people to be compatible, at least those within your platoon?
Oh, sure, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, we got
yeah,
along fairly
yeah.
well. And I bunked with nearby a couple of guys, I think, who were roommates at Ohio State. I think they just happened to randomly get drafted together. I don't know if they signed up together. And then there were guys from other backgrounds, mostly, again, urban and Northeastern. Now,
Hmm.
I did meet several guys from the Rochester, New York area, and it seemed like among this group, many of them had signed up for 3 years. I asked one of
Oh,
them, "Well, how come all you guys are 3-year enlistees instead of just being drafted?" They said, "Well, in Rochester, under their draft board, about 50% of the guys who got drafted were drafted and inducted into the Marines. So, as many of these guys got their draft notice, they'd run down the street to the other recruiters, including the Army recruiter, and say, 'I want to sign up for 3 years. I don't want to take a chance on going into the Marines.'" So that was an eye
that
opener.
explains,
Yeah,
yeah.
explain why they were what they were.
Oh my goodness. So, what was the basic training like? Like, what was a typical day like? And
Okay, a
yeah.
typical day, we'd be up at 5 a.m. We'd have to, I'm not sure if we ran before breakfast, or I know we got ourselves washed up and dressed and everything, went to chow, I think around 6:30, and then training would start probably about 7:30 to 8. We learned some marching. We spent a lot of time on um, the rifle range, and we would have PT, physical training exercises. I think what they used to call the daily dozen. We'd get out in the main sort of big area compound where the barracks would be around the perimeter, and there was somewhat like a track in the middle, but it wasn't a track.
Mm.
It was just a path, and we'd all line up and do the exercises there. We then went to certain classes that might be in classroom buildings or out in the field, learning different aspects of the military. We also were provided a little handbook where we had to learn the general orders. We had to know a little bit about the different ranks within the military and the fact we salute an officer and say, "Good morning, sir," or whatever. You have a certain greeting that you have, and you call your drill sergeant, "Yes, drill sergeant," "No, drill sergeant." You don't call drill sergeant sir, unlike the Marines where they call
Huh.
their GIs sir. But in the military, the refrain is, if you call drill sergeant sir, he says, "Don't call me sir, I work for a living." So, and
Okay.
and many of our drill sergeants were, they had been over in Vietnam and came back and took a drill sergeant course, and they were very knowledgeable and really wanted to help us survive going over to Vietnam, because basically our whole basic training company, they called us like an airborne basic training outfit, but I think that was just something they gave us to build morale. And we spent a lot of our time just basically learning, getting ready for, we learned how to, and oddly enough, we learned how to shoot on the M14. whereas over in Vietnam, they were already using the M16. But when we got over to Vietnam, we would be issued an M16. But we spent a lot of time in the rifle range, marching, doing physical exercises, learning how to use our weapon, including the bayonet. We do the bayonet exercises, and then we go through the what was called the PT, physical training test. And at various times during basic training, we take the test. And sadly, what happened with me was a couple of things. Number one, I had allergies, so I was kind of dragging
Yeah.
as far as some of the physical fitness activities. But luckily, our final PT test occurred the after
Allergies.
the allergy season was over and we had the frost. Second thing was on the rifle range. Um, I I felt somewhat comfortable with doing the shooting. I did fairly well. However, an incident happened in the middle of basic training that affected my ability to shoot, and that was it was the first weekend that several of us were let off of the company training area and could go to the PX and the beer hall. So another couple of guys and I were over on our way to the beer hall, and a couple of guys who had come out and have obviously had been drinking a few beers, got in a little argument with us, and from my back, not even seeing it, some guy who had a crutch banged it over my head. And what this did, besides disabling me a little bit, is it broke my glasses. So all I had left was a pair of sunglasses that I brought into basic training. So while the people on the base were issuing or getting me new regular glasses, I had sunglasses, and we'd go out to rifle range, and it'd be an overcast day. I'd be there in dark glasses, and not being able to see the targets too well, I just sort of aimed to wherever I thought they might be. And so, as a consequence of that, um, our commanding officer, a captain who had been in an engineering unit in Vietnam and thought he was hot stuff, um, lined us all up on the rifle range. He said, "Okay, I'm going to call out several guys. You guys come out front and center." Well, the guys he called out were the ones who shot very poorly that day. Instead of calling out guys who had shot really well and say, "Here are the guys you can emulate and try to look
Yeah.
up to," he put together basically a public humiliation scene. And besides my not even being able to see the targets. We had one guy who had been in the hospital for a week with pneumonia and other things that were
Yeah.
going on that affected people's ability to shoot straight. So that was not a good scene. And he, as I was going up to join the other rest of the group, he said something, and you wanted OCS because I temporarily put in an application to OCS during the basic training. And I said to myself, well, not if it produces officers who pull stunts like this.
Yeah.
And as far as OCS, during the middle of basic training, and I hate to skip around, but
No,
that's the
no, no,
way
no. It's part.
memories
It's still
memories
part of the
come out.
basic training
I
period. Yeah.
I I and others who were college graduates and some junior college graduates were brought into an auditorium, and a captain was extolling the virtues of our trying out for, applying for OCS, Officer Candidate School, become officers, and delay our entrance into the war, etc. So I started an application for OCS, and then about a week before I finished basic training, I was awarded a finance and accounting MOS, military occupational specialties. So
Oh.
I dropped my OCS application, not wanting to trade my finance accounting work for infantry officer training. So I
Makes
I
sense.
did that, yeah, and then going back to the physical training, luckily by the time our final PT test was given, I had scored something like 425 out of 500 points. So I had
Wow.
been up to the physical fitness needed to get through the different exercises, which included at that time, it was the monkey bars, low crawl, a shuttle run,
Oh,
a about 120 or 130-yard man carry, which if we had to
wow.
carry a fellow soldier off the field, and then there was a 1 mile run in our combat boots. So I I somehow got through that and survived it. And we did have one young man who earned himself a 3-day pass by scoring a 500, maxing out all of the exercises. So
But it sounds like it was very manageable, even with the fall allergies and et cetera, that you were
yeah,
able to
yeah,
do, able to achieve it.
I got through training
Yeah.
okay. I mean, I was not the greatest soldier. We had several guys who were what they became were temporary platoon or squad leaders, and they were given little armbands where they were given like corporal stripes so they could sort of tell us what to do and show demonstrate initial leadership qualities. But we had I'd say the training was um, it was somewhat easier, I would expect, versus what I heard later from people who went to basic training at Fort Polk, Fort Benning, and some of the other forts, because we were an East Coast training facility. There are several people, several young men who'd been drafted at various times who had influential parents in politics, etc. And in fact, some there was a story going around, and you don't know how true these are, but
Yeah.
that a few training cycles before ours, the son of the Secretary of the Army was in basic training at Fort Dix, and what they did was they handpicked all of the drill sergeants and the company commander and the first sergeant for that company so that this guy wouldn't complain to his father.
But there was somehow like a reputation that things were being run in a nicer way at Fort Dix than
Less difficult,
at
yeah, less
other,
difficult,
yeah.
and um, but we still had to do some very basic things in learning combat arms and the um, chain of command and various other things that have to do with the military and getting in step with the marching and um, drilling with the rifles and so forth. So
Was the reason that you were training on F-14s rather than F-16s?
M14s,
Excuse me,
F14s, a
M-14s.
fighter.
That's what I meant to
That's
say.
all right. That's
Thank you.
okay.
Meant to
M14.
F-14. Was that because it was it was just simply the M16s were not available for training
I
purposes?
think that
Is
was it.
it?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
M16s were not available for training, and so they were all sent over to Vietnam for men in the field there, and I only got trained on the M16 a very short while after I was permanent party at Fort Dix, which we can go into in a little bit.
A little bit. That's right. So maybe now's a good time to talk about your first assignment.
Okay,
Yeah.
my first assignment out of basic was I was one of 6 out of several thousand trainees in that cycle who was assigned to the Fort Dix Post Finance Office. And again, the other guys who were assigned to the finance office who I met in my travels were MBAs, CPAs. They'd been out in the business world, etc. So I ended up going into I think it was an accounts payable section where I coded different payable invoices, etc. It was not difficult work, but it was in keeping with what I knew in accounting, finance, and business.
You mentioned that you learned on the job, but was there any mentor or anybody helpful to you?
Well, there were a
And
couple of ladies who were in the section who helped out and oriented me, and it was not a very difficult job. It just took a little while to learn, and the other guys might have been working in the pay section. They could have been working in various and sundry accounting and finance roles.
were the ladies in the military in that office,
No,
or
they were
they?
civilian. They were all civilian employees, and um, one of the interesting things about Fort Dix and the finance office and the employees there was we had a gentleman there who was in the army. He'd been assigned to the office some months before, or a year before, or whatever, before we were. And what I learned about him was that one day, Friday afternoon, he was a soldier. Then Monday morning, he was in civilian clothes. Well, what I learned was that he was a civilian working in that office, got drafted. The people in that office were able to convince the folks at Fort Dix after his basic training that he can come back, work in the office as a military guy, as a soldier. Then, as soon as his 2 years were up, he'd go back to being a civilian worker in the office, same seat, doing same work, and it just he changed his clothes. So that was one of the really interesting little sidelights of that adventure.
And what did you do for entertainment when you were at this point you were part of what was called the permanent party, which I
Yeah,
believe is a permanent duty station at
yeah.
Fort Dix?
Well, yeah, I was in what was called Company A Special Troops. We had uh, soldiers who worked at various places on the base, either in it could be in the offices and personnel, finance, could be at the gymnasium, could be other other areas around the base, and they would some of them, in fact, were would did their training at Fort Dix, had their um, job at Fort Dix, and then they never left Fort Dix in their whole 2 years
Huh.
as far as their assignment. They would go home weekends and so forth. So in our off-duty hours, I hung around with a couple of guys who were Vietnam veterans. While in the barracks, we talk. Sometimes they talk about their war stories and tell ways for me to help survive my time knowing I was going there. And then outside of the barracks, there were a couple other guys who were college grads who were assigned to the base, and we would meet at an off-base beer hall type place, tavern, and just have a few beers and swap stories about our life, and where we'd come from, where we were going. And in one of those cases, I happened to meet a guy whose name I'd seen in
Hmm.
the newspapers in Western New York. He was a cross country runner who had gone to a university outside Syracuse, New York, and he competed against a buddy who grew up with me on my block. So you get these sort of small world type connections, and it was fascinating to learn both about the guys who had been over to Germany and were finishing their last 6 or 8 months in the service, the guys who'd been to Vietnam and still had X amount of time to go, and many of the guys, at least in Vietnam, who were, say, 3 year guys who came back to the States, they were serving out their time. They had some time to decompress from their Vietnam War service, whereas mine ended up very differently than theirs. And I really appreciated the ideas they had. They weren't jealous of the fact that I was in finance and they had been infantry people or anything. They
Wow.
they knew that there were people who supported them, the 5 or 6 people who were behind doing the support of the fighting person out on the
Mm.
front lines. So they appreciated that, and that was where I met a guy who had been in the first Cav, and he seemed to be one of the most gung ho of the various guys I met who had either served in the Big Red One, the 101st Airborne,
Yeah.
the various other units that were in Vietnam. He seemed to be the most gung ho. I said, "Well, I hope I don't get assigned to the first Cav." So of course, what happened? But it was a decent experience. We also there was a movie theater on the base. I think I went to maybe 1 or 2 movies. Also, because our hours were generally 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, we got most weekends off unless I had guard duty or some other duty, and I would go and take a bus up to the Newark airport and get on one of these half-fare flights to go to Boston or to go to D.C. to visit friends and other people I knew. And then I think, in fact, with the guy who was the first Cav vet, I think we took a little bus trip one night or a couple days up to the Princeton, New Jersey
Mm.
area just to get away from the base, and that was good. So, and there was a couple of guys, or several of them, well, one in particular, I'll say at least, who was very smart with his month's pay. We got paid at the beginning of the month,
Hmm.
and what he'd do is he'd go down to the bus station at Fort Dix, buy 4 round-trip bus tickets to New York City, where his parents and relatives were, so that even if he was out of money at any time during the month, he could get on the bus, go home, grab a few bucks, and come back to the to the to the base. So and people did travel. Some did travel off the base during the weekends. Now, there were some days, and in fact, weekends where I might have duty what happened was our Company A Special Troops, because we had a lot of guys who had been to Vietnam, Germany, they were already E4s, E5s, Spec 4s, Spec 5s, and many of them were excused from the duty roster, which meant that those of us who were private E2s or PFCs, E3s, would have to do a lot of KP duty, guard duty, whatever. And so we just sucked it up and did it. Now, what I learned late on during the time I was permanent party, we had a new commanding officer for our company. I said, well, does anybody know why the last guy left? It didn't seem like he had been there long enough to go to
Mm.
a new assignment. And one of the guys said, oh, well, he was selling to these Spec 4 and Spec 5s exemptions from what little duty they had to do on the duty roster. So he was pocketing money, saying, okay, I'll get you off of duty. You pay me $50 or whatever it is, so you can have the whole weekend off, because they would have duties within the company and their own duties. We had the lower level duties, and so it was there are a lot of interesting little aspects of this
Going.
permanent party.
And you mentioned that you liked talking to the men who had been in Vietnam
Yes.
and learning tips for survival.
Yeah.
So, what were some of the lessons learned before you even left to Vietnam?
Well, just to listen very closely to the NCOs that you're dealing with over there and over here in training, any training we got, just uh, make sure you um, watch yourself around the base, and um, look after you and your fellow soldiers, and just kind of make sure that as soon as you hear the incoming of mortars or rockets, get down on the ground immediately.
Immediately.
And
Yeah.
that helped me in Vietnam, that's for sure, because that was a
Yeah.
reaction we learned. Because over in Vietnam, what happened was there'd be civilian workers coming on the base between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m., and usually the mortar and rocket attacks would occur at 5:30 a.m. or 8:30 p.m. So
Oh, I
that
see.
was that, and they told us some of those things that would happen over there. Make sure you and they just tell general stories of their experience, how they were out in the bush, and so it gave me an appreciation of
Mm.
people who were out on the front lines in the infantry in the event I ever had to go out to those smaller bases or landing zones, the LZs or anything like that. So it was uh, it was useful.
Did you think, or did you know that you would ultimately be sent to Vietnam, or was there a possibility that you could stay for the permanent party on at Fort Dix?
Not really, but basically, starting I think around February, is that those of us who were assigned to administrative jobs started getting orders that came down and were called levies. That would be, all right, 1,000 soldiers this month have to go over to Vietnam, and we knew I'd get there eventually. What I didn't know, what I thought I would happen, was that I would be assigned to a very, very large base, such as Da Nang, Bien Hoa, Saigon, etc., and be in some air-conditioned office. And so, much to my surprise, that did not happen. But overall, yeah, we got dispersed through different commands, different areas of Vietnam, uh, different divisions and units. So I never really saw any of the guys who I knew from that Company A Special Troops, never saw any of them over in Vietnam. Now, one of the guys from the finance office did get assigned up to a finance office in Da Nang at the big Da Nang base.
Mm.
And I think we wrote back and forth a couple of times, but that was it. I didn't really have any contact with them.
Yeah. Um, it sounds like before you were deployed to Vietnam that you had a little bit of time because you mentioned visiting business schools to do MBA or other programs as well
Right.
as friends and relatives. Do you
Yes.
want to talk about that
Yes. Well,
period?
um, there are a couple things going on during that period. Um, I got leave starting in late April through the end of May, 30 plus day leave I processed out. And there were several occurrences that affected me then. One was that I went to my sister's junior college graduation,
Mm.
which was oddly enough, a New Jersey um, school, Centenary College for
Nearby.
Women in Hackettstown, but I'd already gone to Buffalo, so I went back to Hackettstown, went to her graduation, and I was proud of that. And then, sadly, about a week later, I got notification that my high school, or not my high school, my college roommate, who had been going to Boston University Law School and whom I visited on a weekend pass,
Hmm.
had died suddenly. He had some kind
Oh.
of a brain tumor and was
Oh.
dead within several days of the hospital discovering it. So it put me sort of into a fatalistic mood. Figured from that point forward, going over Vietnam, I'm sort of living on borrowed time, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm.
But on the other hand, I was able to, I was thinking about life after the service, so I visited several graduate business schools, and I also, I believe I took a trip down to Durham, North Carolina, see some old college buddies, and that's where I met a gentleman who had been going to college, went in the service, was over in Vietnam, was a lieutenant with the 101st Airborne,
Oh.
got wounded, and he got back into school, and he had some kind of a defect with his disability with his arm, but he uh, just, I told him, well, I'm going to Vietnam, and he said, well, here's some things to look out for. That was interesting, seeing some old people I knew from my college days,
Yeah.
and I did keep in touch with them somewhat.
Were you involved? Would you write letters to them,
Not
etc.?
really.
Right,
I,
right,
I
yeah.
just visited them
And
that
you had,
particular time, and uh, the I primarily just I didn't write too much, I guess, at that time. I was just getting prepared to go overseas. I put together a list of people I wanted my parents notified if I was killed in action, and so I burned the love letters of my high school sweetheart. So,
so I was curious about that. So why did you didn't want any old embarrassing
right, yeah, in case something happened.
okay.
Yes, that's definitely it.
What was your parents' reaction to your deployment? Like and
Well,
ask and giving them the list of names.
well,
Yeah.
I guess both they and I expected that I'd eventually end up over in Vietnam because that's where all the guys who were getting drafted then were going. And I, for a while, I was thinking about, well, would I want to maybe join the Navy as an enlisted person for 4 years, take my chances, maybe go to Navy OCS? But then I thought, well, I'll take my chances with 2 years. I've got a good college background, and luckily in my initiation week at the what I call 0 week at
Hmm.
basic training, I went in and talked to a personnel clerk, and he said, "Well, what would you like to get into, given your college background?" And I said, "Well, one first would be intelligence area, second finance, and third, I think I had to pick a combat arm, so I picked either artillery or armor. I didn't pick infantry, but
Yeah.
so there were people. I had an inkling that based upon how I did in basic training with the intelligence test and the fact I got a finance MOS, that okay, I'm going over to Vietnam, but I'll probably be in a more safe, secure area. So my parents were probably felt more positive about the situation, even though I knew, well, the rockets and the mortars fall on base camps too, and there had been some attacks during the time I was following the news of course, the attack on the embassy compound during Tet and attacks on major bases where people did die who were in just minding their own business in offices.
Yeah. Yeah. Were you aware, out of curiosity, about the GI Bill when you were um, visiting different graduate business schools
Well,
or
I knew there were GI Bill
Bill? Yeah.
benefits.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
wasn't a big
Yeah.
thing. It was
Yeah.
just went along with the territory of being in the military.
Yeah. So, how did you fly to Vietnam?
All right,
Your route? Yeah.
I was had to report into Fort Lewis, Washington around, I think it was June 1st or May 31st. I forgot which day, but anyway, reported in there. I flew out there, and then we were in the transition barracks there, transient barracks there for a few days, and
Mm.
got our clothing for I think we got our jungle fatigues and stuff. I don't fully remember, but I know we were outfitted with whatever we needed, and then we took a flight in a civilian airliner, and I'm not sure what airlines took us over there. I remember which airlines got us back, but over there we went up to stop just outside Anchorage, Alaska, probably at Elmendorf Air Force Base, then over in Yokota Air Force Base in Japan outside Tokyo. That was the second stop. And then we landed at Cameron Bay. And the time we landed at Cameron Bay, the first impression we got was got out of the plane. It was, I think, evening, and there was something about the smell of the air. The air smelled different. So it took a little while to get used to that. And because there were so many people coming into Cameron Bay as a transit point, is that many of us slept out on the sand for a couple or
Oh,
three nights.
wow.
They didn't even have space in the permanent barracks that they had there. So
Hmm.
that was uh, that was an interesting few days. I don't remember very much about it
Yeah.
because I was still kind of scared about
Yeah.
being over there a little bit and
Yeah.
apprehensive, and didn't know what the next step would be. I thought, well, okay, I'm here in Cameron Bay. I'll probably get assigned to some big finance office. Well, then the orders came through that I was going down to Benoit in the first Cav division, and I think we took maybe a C-130 down from Cameron Bay to Benoit. Got uh, then was assigned to what was called the First Team Academy (FTA), which was the orientation 4 or 5 days into the Cav for all guys who were processing into the division. So we got down there and we were provided some little bit of training about being in the jungle, being in, um, where we might eventually be, and we were uh, one of the classes we happened to be facing the Benoit Air Force Base, the major landing strip,
Mm.
and we were halfway through a class, and all of a sudden everybody's staring over at the landing strip, and it was a U-2 spy plane that was coming in for a landing.
Oh, my.
And that was the first, last, and
Yeah.
only U-2 spy plane I've ever seen in my life. So they were obviously spying, going over North Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, etc., doing high altitude reconnaissance. So
Reconnaissance, yeah.
that was interesting. And then,
Out of curiosity, just go step back a little bit. Like, what was the smell caused by? Was it something as a result of, I don't know,
I don't know, maybe
fallout from a mission?
vegetation, the foods that the people were eating, maybe the oil and gas that was around the base, and just
Yeah.
I don't know. It just
Yeah.
had a um, different environment from what I was used
That's,
to over here in the States.
yeah. Were you hit by other things as well, being in a new environment, such as the heat or the
Oh, the heat,
landscape?
yes, the heat
Yeah.
was really stifling. I got there in the first week in June, so it was actually it was the it was the season of the wet monsoon. It would be fairly warm during the day. We might get rains. We had some steady rains over the month of June, July, and then went into the dry monsoon season. But yeah, it was either hot and dry or hot and wet over there, and so we learned that it was muddy when it was hot and wet, and it was very dusty when it was hot and dry.
That's right.
Yeah.
Um, so, what did you do during, I forget the term, but basically like your orientation at Benoit, like when you, for a few days, like what?
Well,
Yeah.
I guess they were orienting us into uh, life in Vietnam, how to, um, I guess, not survive, but just providing us um, some little pamphlets of here is an English to Vietnamese language, and here are some sayings like "We are friendly troops." Remember this saying. Remember this. If you might get captured by people, or you might end up getting separated from your troops, or if you're a pilot or something, you get down in friendly territory and you tell them, yeah, I'm with the friendlies and so forth, um, and that just and then things about that we also were taught about in basic training about the Geneva Convention, how if you are captured, all you have to do is give name, rank, and serial number. But we weren't really thinking in those terms. We were just trying to get oriented into, okay, here's what the division's doing in Vietnam. Here's why we are in Vietnam. And they stressed that through,
Mm.
from basic all the way through uh, in our permanent party training sessions at Fort Dix and then in Vietnam. Well, here's why we're here, here's what we're doing here, and all of that. So it was a little bit of propaganda, a little bit of orientation, and just understanding uh, the the division we were in, and just do your job, keep your nose clean, and everything will work out. We were also issued, besides the, and I'm not sure at what point we got jungle fatigues and other jungle
Hmm.
stuff. We were issued a rifle. We were issued M16. We also got the famous ration card, which over there, what they allowed soldiers to do was buy X number of cartons. I think it was 3 cartons of cigarettes a month. You could buy up to X number of cases of beer. You could go into the PX and they would punch the card if you got a camera or a video,
Mm.
audio recorder or a transistor radio, because the items were so cheap over there that if you didn't have this ration card, then people would go in, buy a transistor radio this week. Okay, they break it in 2 weeks or something happens to it, they lose it. They go buy another one. They didn't want that to happen. They wanted to
Yeah.
make sure everybody had a shot at getting stuff at that was available at the PX.
Oh, so so what? Which radio stations would you hear?
We would generally hear the was I think it was I forgot what the military radio station was, but it was a AFVN or something. There was
Yeah.
something that the famous Adrian Cronauer, the guy who was in the movie Good Morning Vietnam, that portrayed him, that sort of thing. It
Oh,
was the
yeah.
Armed Forces
Yeah.
Vietnam radio. We also would get radio transmissions of things like football games during the bowl season. Also,
Yeah.
we got, I think, the radio transmission of the Ollie Frazier fight later
Mm.
in March of '71. And but I guess what happened was I would read a little bit of the Stars and Stripes newspaper. People would get sent newspapers from their hometown, get Sunday versions of those, and they did have some magazines such as Newsweek and Time and others in the PX that we had on base. So I mean we were fairly informed, and then of course
Yeah.
just from hearing soldiers coming back from the field and what they were doing, we'd find out what was going on within the division.
Yeah. So I think we left off that you're at Benoit, and we're talking about what was available
Yeah.
and there. And then how long was it till you were assigned to Fugue Vin?
Okay. It was only about 4 or 5 days that I was then assigned to the public information office. And when I got my orders and it said public information office, I asked some sergeant, well, I'm not a journalist, I'm not a photographer. What's this about? Is this correct orders? I thought I'd be on the Benoit base in the finance office there.
Mm.
So he went back, checked on it, said, no, this is correct. So then I take a short flight up to Fuquin, get off the aircraft, and then I go over to this public information office and I said, okay, I'm Mason Holmes, I'm here, what do you want me to do? And thinking, well, I'm not a writer, I'm not a photojournalist, so what's the deal? They said, oh, you're working over at our gift shop. I said, gift shop? And they took me over and they explained that, okay, this is a gift shop that's owned by the 1st Cavalry Division Association, staffed by active duty troopers, and we sell CAV logoed photo albums, pocket knives, watches, and a yearbook to people who are troops out in the field. And with the proceeds, we fund scholarships, college scholarships for the sons and daughters of men who are killed in action. So I thought, well, that's really a neat job. And I was to be the accountant. There was a guy there
Yeah.
who had been in country for several months, and I found out just about a year ago that he actually was only in country about 6 months. He ended up getting a hardship deferment because he had to go back and take care of an ailing parent. But he oriented me to the gift shop, and we sold our goods to the guys who were on the base and coming back in from the field. And as I mentioned at the very outset, that it was sort of a general show place, and where he would tell either reporters, other dignitaries coming through town. I think we did meet a couple of U.S. representatives or political types and say, well, this is our something to do to build the morale, keep the morale up for the guys. And we we were very successful. And when this yearbook came out, it was done by the guys in the Public Information Office, put all together, photos, writing, etc. And we understood that the story was that when the commander of the Public Information Office wanted to tell the higher ups, well, we're going to order 25,000 copies of this book. And the higher ups said, what? 25,000? You'll never sell 25,000. Well, it so happened that while I was over there in Vietnam, we sold around 9,000 copies. And then within a few years after that, all the copies had been sold. And
Wow.
this was it was really a history of the division in Vietnam from 65 to 69, and it told about all the major units, the infantry battalions, the support battalions, and uh, aviation brigade, etc.,
Hmm.
told their major actions, provided maps of major military actions and engagements, and gave a listing of up until that point. There were about, I think, 12 or 13 Medal of Honor awardees from the division for the Vietnam War. And in fact, many years later, as I am now in the 1st Cavalry Division's Sheridan's Cavalry chapter, we have a Medal of Honor recipient, Alan Lynch, who is very prominent in the area, and we had learned about his what was the actions that he based on his award and everything, really heroic. And he's done a lot of good in Veterans Affairs, spent his whole basically working life after the military in Veterans Affairs. And in fact, just recently, and I found this out at our 1st Cav uh, chapter Christmas party, that he had gone ahead and published a book through the McCormick Pritzker Museum Library, and it's called From Zero to Hero, and I'm about a third of the way through the book. So that's really fascinating history about him and life in the service when he was in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And he was the spokesman, I believe, at the gala as
Oh, I'm
well.
sure he's
Yeah,
he's
yeah,
been he's been invited to speak before many groups, and several of us have gone to those groups and shown up as support for him and as fellow cab troopers. And kind of skipping far ahead is getting involved in veterans activities now as I meet people who served at many different times, including after the Vietnam War and before the Vietnam War, who served in the cab, and it's a source of pride. Whereas at the time, I didn't think much about the big yellow patch. So, well, let's continue where we were, and they can edit this any way they want.
that's fine. No, that's
So
fine.
let's see.
No,
Okay,
this
I
is
got
fine.
assigned up to Fuquien. I got there on about the late in the first week of June,
Hmm.
and as I mentioned, coming in country, it was the wet monsoon season, so we would get heavy rains and all of that, um, and it was hot and sticky. Now, where the shop was, it was located on the perimeter of basically a big parade ground
Hmm.
that had at one end of the parade ground, they had a post office, they had a PX, they had an enlisted man's club, they had another, I don't know, engineering office or something. They had our hooch, our first team scholarship gift shop, and next door to us was a reenlistment group of sergeants. Uh, and then there was a library that was in a sort of a what you consider maybe a house trailer or something that was also there. And then further back there was the chapel. I don't recall going to church services there, but
But it was
anyway,
there.
it was there.
Yeah. Where were you living? Were they hooches, or what were
Okay,
the
we lived
arrangements?
we lived in a 1-story wooden-sided building with some screens on the outside because of the weather. It was never that cold. Um, and that was about a quarter of a mile away from where I worked at the gift shop. So because when I got up in the morning and came back at night and had to walk about a quarter of a mile, I had most of my meals over at the 13th Signal Battalion Mess Hall, which was closer to where I worked. So our hours were generally that we were working from about 7 a.m. till around 6:30 p.m. and we'd close the shop down, and then we would if we were in the shop hanging out, we'd maybe go over to the beer yard, get some cold beer, get some beer, and we had a little mini fridge, luckily, in the shop, so we could keep our beers cold and just swap life stories. And if not, uh, if we wanted to go back to our hooch where we uh, lived and slept, we could go back, and usually a few guys were around there to chit chat, and we had one hooch that seemed like we called that the juicers hooch, the guys who drank beer in the evening. The other guys were the heads. They were they were the ones who were smoking the grass and all of that. So we had a couple of distinct groups in this, and these guys who were the uh, in the public information office, we bunked with a lot of guys who were journalists, photojournalists, and writers, and I think there were maybe a few guys who worked in other places on the base camp. But it was a fairly large base camp. I'm not sure how many total troops were there, but there were headquarters for several aviation units. There was a medical battalion there.
Hmm.
There was also, I think, somewhere, I'm not sure if it was in the middle of the camp, but there was actually, I think, a prisoner of war
Oh,
facility
oh,
in the middle.
were there
At
prisoners?
some, yeah, there were some prisoners that they captured, and maybe it was a transition point until they went to elsewhere for further interrogation. I don't know exactly what happened there, but it was there. And then I think I saw from time to time. I think there were some maybe ARVN, Army of the Republic of Vietnam, soldiers detachment or something in the area. Now, for our for doing the laundry for um, the people who were working KP at the general's compound and building areas. Uh, there were a lot of civilians who worked on base, and then we had what were called hooch maids, these ladies who would wash our clothes and clean out the hooches, and we each kicked in, I don't know, several bucks a month and paid for their services of cleaning and tidying up and washing uniforms, whatever they did. And so they, you know,
Were, um, what was the connection like, or were you able to communicate at all, or were you ever, or were they trustworthy, or
oh yeah, they
yeah,
were. Yeah,
yeah.
they'd been vetted and screened so that they were generally, um, on our side as civilian workers. But then there were some, again, I mentioned that what happened with mortar and rocket attacks, because the civilians were on the base between 6 a.m. and 8 p.m., mortar attacks typically, and they would come sometimes from the village, from the geographic location of the village.
Hmm.
They'd be at 5:30 a.m. or at 8:30 p.m. But there were some interesting uh, situations that came up. One of which was that there was I guess, some infantry lieutenant or captain who came into the general's mess, and he saw some civilian, apparently a civilian employee on KP, said, "Hey, I know that guy. That happened to be some NVA prisoner who escaped the
Oh,
the captors and was working in the mess hall and
pretending.
picking up intelligence from whatever people were saying, and I mean, just crazy stuff like that. So you never knew who was friend or who was foe. But generally, no, there were not. Unlike Afghanistan and what we've heard about Afghanistan and lesser about Iraq, is there have not been really some attacks by allies on our troops. So at least while I was there weren't any. So
Would you ever go into this neighboring village?
not really. No, I think the only time I left Fuquin and went into a village was when I went up to the camp at Song Bay, which was known as Fire Support Base Buttons. And several of us took a Jeep ride out into the countryside and visited some little hamlet or something. But it was we were going and getting, at that time, these guys were going after and getting these Montagnard crossbows. The Montagnards who
Yeah.
fought with us were they had a lot of their weaponry, a lot of was not necessarily rifles, but these crossbows, and they sold them to the soldiers. So
Yeah.
we went up there. But no, I really never went into the village of Fuquin. We had all we needed up on the large base camp, and I believe there were probably limits as far as people going into the adjoining village. It never really
Cross your mind.
crossed my
Yeah.
mind.
Yeah.
No,
No.
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 The only other places I visited, I went down to Benoit when we were after we had sold so many goods and we collected so much money. I'd go down there, make a bank deposit on the Air Force side of the Benoit base, or we'd go down there and we opened up a little, I think it was a sort of a gift shop annex or something down there, and I'd check on them. And but as far as traveling around a lot around Vietnam, I didn't do that. So
When you were traveling from, like you're saying, to make the deposits from the
yeah.
gift shop or to open the auxiliary shop, would you go by helicopter or by airplane?
Oh,
How would
went
it
by
work?
helicopter. Generally helicopter. I'd jump on a helicopter, whether it was um, a, a Loach, a two-person, one with a bubble in front, or the Huey, which was the one that carried 8 or 10 people. And yeah, I did go up to Song Bay on a helicopter. I went to Benoit on a helicopter, and um, I'm trying to think other. I had several rides that I'd just catch and go to the, and normally I'd be at the Benoit Army part of the base, which was we had a lot of temporary barracks, and whereas over on the Air Force side they had those permanent buildings and a huge PX that we didn't have over on the Army side. It was something.
Um, were you concerned? Like, did you feel in danger while you were traveling from one point to another?
Not really, not while I was flying. It was, I guess, what I was concerned about, and it really didn't hit me until after it happened, was when we took the Jeep ride from Song Bay out in the countryside as these guys were getting a hold of these Montagnard crossbows. I was thinking, well, hey, we could be ambushed on this road. It was one of those roads that I didn't know how secure it was, and I didn't think about it until after we returned and realized that we had not really taken with us enough weapons to defend ourselves if there were some kind of a ambush out from the jungle. So
So, yeah. Well, you mentioned that unfortunately there had been mortar and rocket attacks,
yes,
and you want to talk about the one that happened on your birthday? I think you said it was
shortly after
March
my
12th,
birthday,
12th, I think.
few days after my birthday.
Yeah.
What happened that evening was that a bunch of us, probably 60, 70 people, were in the EM club. There was some kind of entertainment there, and we were listening to entertainment, and all of a sudden we hear the boop, boop, and you hear the distinctive sound of a mortar. And what the enemy does is they send out a mortar, then they adjust the tube, and another mortar lands 25 or 30 meters from
Oh.
that one. Then they keep what they call walking them in. And what
Mhm.
happened that evening were a couple of things. Number one was that the mortars hit right near the back of the service club. One mortar hit near the back of the service club. The other mortar hit near the front entrance. Now, the lady who was in charge, the Red Cross worker, Tina, who really, I think, saved some lives that night, she told us all to get down, but then a couple of guys ran toward the bunker out in the back, and unfortunately, one of the mortars landed on the edge of the bunker, killed one of the guys, wounded the other, and that stuff unfortunately happens. But she, I think, by her quick thinking and not having us go in 6 different directions trying to avoid the mortar, we were lucky enough that one didn't land in the middle of the service club, and I think she was helpful in saving lives. Now, two other elements of that attack, one which was kind of a little humorous, was that I found out later the next day that one of the mortars from that attack had landed in one of our Connex storage containers and blown away some of the merchandise for the shop plus part of the accounting records.
The cat
And
records.
and then the other incident was that the lieutenant who had been in charge of our shop up until that time was running across the compound, and he got wounded by the mortar. But that's not the whole story, is that this lieutenant who had gone through ROTC and college at the same time I'd gone to college, graduated the same year, he'd accepted a scholarship his last couple of years, so he owed the Army 4 years of active duty, and somehow was thinking, well, maybe I'm not going to go to Vietnam. But he ended up over in Vietnam, and usually for junior officers, the program was that you go out into the bush for 6 months. You command an infantry platoon for 6 months, and if you survive that, you get a job at the rear. Well, they already had enough infantry platoon leaders out in the infantry units, so he ended up being on the base for 6 months, working at the shop as the business manager, the head of it. Now, as soon as he got his orders to go join an infantry company,
Hmm.
he started running over to the chaplain to see if he could get out of that duty by calling himself a conscientious objector. So the big irony is, here's the guy who was planning to try to get out of the field as a conscientious objector. He gets wounded by a mortar attack. So,
And wins a Purple Heart, I think
yeah,
you've
right. Yeah, and he got
mentioned.
a Purple Heart out of it. So he ended up getting out of it and not having to go up on charges that having people investigate whether he was truly a conscientious objector, because those people who say they were of the Quaker religion or some other aspect of their background, that they were legitimately, they would not, not point a rifle at somebody else. They would go ahead and work in some support position to,
Mhm.
do their service and go forward. So we, I felt that was a critical point, and other rocket attacks and mortar attacks were not as close as that one. That one was where I thought, wow, this could be it. And
Yeah.
so and I've been trying to locate that donut dolly ever since, and I've been in contact with a donut dolly uh, who had written a book about her time in Vietnam. She gave a presentation before our first Cab Association chapter, and I said, "Did you know this person, or how could I get a hold of this person to thank her?" And I really think she helped save a lot of lives that evening.
Well, there are a few interviews with donor dollies that we've done sort of
Hmm.
before my time, and I'm
Yeah.
wondering if any of them. I think one of them is from Vietnam, and I'll try to
If she
find it
was
and send
there
the
during the
link.
time, see, they
Yeah,
were spread throughout the country in different bases,
yeah.
and this would have been because the mortar attack was in March of 71, it'd be somebody who was based there sometime late 70, early 71, and then there was a young lady, very thin black girl whose name I think was Ginny. This girl's name was Tina, and that's all I know. I
Tina.
don't know her
Yeah,
last name or
yeah.
anything, but uh, she was really helpful.
So very quick thinking that she figured if one mortar's here and the other one's there, the best thing would be to stay
Be
put
stay put, yeah,
and
to
lie
just
down and
not
yeah,
try to
yeah.
have all kinds of mass confusion
Confusion.
of people trying to get out and maybe getting injured trying to get out, and having like a stampede type thing
Yeah,
happen. So
yeah.
yeah,
Did you have other contact with the donut dollies while you were there?
not a lot. No, there were some in the EM club, but not really. It wasn't like the folks who were out at the base camps who would have couple donut dollies visit them from time to time. And the other thing that uh, men at the large base camps like Benoit, Da Nang, etc., they sometimes got those Bob Hope visits from the States. And we were at a location that during the time I was there, we didn't get any major entertainment visits. We got basically, I guess, local entertainers, some Vietnamese or Oriental entertainers, but not the main,
Star.
not the big stars. Not the big stars. That's all right.
It sounded like music, though, in general, was a big part of keeping people's morale. I think you'd
Oh,
mentioned
sure,
like
yeah.
people.
We listened to the cassette tapes of the uh, Scott McKenzie's famous song, San Francisco. and the Creedence Clearwater Revival, other groups that were there in the late 60s, early 70s, because as many of us were college graduates, we went through college during the 60s, the hard rock, the acid rock, etc.
Mm.
And we just were tuned into those. And there were other guys who, a lot of the black guys listened to the soul music, Motown. Some of the guys from rural areas listened to country western songs, etc. So they listened to country music, and there were different tastes that people had, and we'd get together and just listen to the stuff, drink a few beers, and a couple of guys would get shipped to them these uh, posters, uh,
Mm.
the acid rock posters, etc. Funny stuff.
Um, something you mentioned in the notes was that there, there was a degree of racial tension, and you gave like what seemed like an innocent remark that got
Oh yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah.
well, what happened when I was processing in country, part of my, I guess I had a day stay or something down in Long Bin, and we're in this barracks, and what happened was there were several blacks, several whites, and several of the blacks were playing loud music, and I asked one guy to if you could just turn the music down a little bit, and he said, well, I'm not going to, and he brandished a 2x4 and said, are you going to make me? And I just backed off, and later on I learned that some of the guys who I was with said, well, we'd support you if there was a fight to break out, and I didn't want to start my
Yeah.
tour of duty in the middle of a brawl, so that happened. But later,
Yeah.
later on, it was
Yeah.
more subtle. That I'd
Yeah.
say that because of also the racial tensions in the United States, civil rights, etc., that there, the blacks a lot of times stayed by themselves. There were only a few times where I actually hung out with anybody who was other than white, and just whites would stay with whites, blacks with blacks, and it was a time where black power was a big thing among the minorities, and these guys would go through these elaborate greetings to each other. They'd be bumping their fists and bumping elbows and all this stuff, and they'd have all of these braided things around their necks. They'd have wristbands and things. And I don't know. It's just okay. They identified with themselves, and uh, it it. I think it was more endemic on the large base camps where you had a lot of people with support duties, whereas out in the field, guys
Mm.
didn't have time for that. You were all in it together, and the blood was red no matter what the color of the skin was. So,
Yeah.
I mean, guys I talked to who were out in the field said they really didn't experience a lot of that, and they also experienced less of the pot smoking and drinking that were on the base camps. And basically, when we were there in 70, 71, as they were drawing troops down, the big mantra was, don't be the last guy killed in Vietnam. And
Yeah.
that was the concern. So um, we just, that's how we acted.
Did you have other duties in addition to those connected to accounting of the gift shop, for example? Did you have to stand guard at all or do
Well,
KP or?
well, I only had to do guard, I think, 1 or 2 nights my whole 10.5 months I was there. So, no, I really didn't have other duties because in some of the mess halls, again, did have some civilian KPs, or they would have, you know, soldiers of lower ranks who would do those. Um,
So,
so,
so, so that's good. What were well throughout your service? What were your impressions of the quality of the leadership?
well, I think the quality ranged the same way it does out in civilian life, is you have very, very good leaders, and in fact, one of the leaders who was on his way up to probably 4 stars, General George Casey, sadly was killed in a
Mm.
helicopter crash. He and his whole group in that helicopter about 6 weeks after I got into country. Now, he was one of those guys who was a very sharp leader, and his chief of staff E.C. Meyer, he was not on the chopper. He survived, so he went on to become 4 stars and chief of staff of the Army. Others who were in command of the division were very high quality leadership. Now, as you went further down the ranks, I noticed that one of the areas where the the individuals who did not have either at that time command or a senior staff role, a lot of majors. There was one major up at Song Bay who just ran around harassing the troops, and he was that's all he did. He didn't really have a
Roll.
role. He was an assistant brigade commander, assistant battalion commander or something, and he really didn't have a role. And so he'd run around and he once came, I think he came up behind me and he was looking at my neck and he said something like, "Soldier, you need a haircut." I said, "Well, if you have a problem, you can talk my captain down in Fuke Vin." I used the old chain of commands idea to get away from that one. But and then we did have some uh, senior NCOs who were pretty high quality, the guys who were in the reenlistment office. But we did have some folks like there was one guy named Smitty. He had evidently been up and down the ranks and was probably, I think, about late 30s, early 40 years old. I don't know how he got to stay in the service, but he became a salesman in the shop, and he'd come in some Monday into the shop all bruised and beat up and like he got in a bar fight or something. And I don't know, just and then the other element was the difference between guys who are West Point grads, OCS, ROTC grads. The first lieutenant that I worked for in our little gift shop, he had been out in the field for about 30 days, got reassigned to the rear, and I think it was because he was not really a great infantry leader. And he was not all that bright either. So there, it varied.
Ranges, yeah.
It varied just like the general population, and same thing with the enlisted ranks. We had some very sharp enlisted personnel, including the guys who were in basic training, and then we had an E8 who was in our a barracks, I guess a barracks NCO for our special troops at Fort Dix, who got us. At first, we didn't like him very much, but what he did was he said, "You clean the barracks, and I'm going to make sure you guys don't have to stand up for reveille. Because if your floor in the barracks got the top level of cleanliness, you'd be excused from getting up at 5 a.m. or 5:30, get out there in the dark, and listen to reveille and have to stand up
Yeah.
there." So we were able to sleep until 6:30,
Yeah.
7 o'clock. So and it varied again among the officers and the enlisted. And then I mentioned, I think, that we had the Public Information Office deputy commander of that was a captain who had been in the military. He got out of the military, came back in, and he was one of these really hardcore types who, even on the base camp, where normally you didn't salute anybody below a major, because if the enemy had been spying you anywhere, they'd see who the officer was. So, and he insisted people uh, salute him. So I don't know. And I guess again, just like the population, there was a variety of leadership, and some that was not so great, some that was excellent. And since then, I've learned that among the commanding generals of the 1st Cav Division, many of those have gone up to 4 stars and higher positions within
Wow.
in the overall military, which makes me somewhat proud to be part of the CAV. And
Yeah.
at the time, I just thought, well, I'm just assigned to this unit. I'll go home, take off my uniform, go about my business. But then later on, I learned more about the 1st Cav's history and appreciated it somewhat more.
Yeah. Um, you mentioned in the notes that you had contact with Australian soldiers who came into the gift shop and they were also a source of information.
Well, a little bit about their experience about being with the Allied soldiers. We had Republic of Korea soldiers. We had some. There were Australian soldiers there in Vietnam. I think there were some Canadians. There were people from various Western countries who I didn't meet too many of them, but it was just interesting meeting them and learning about them. We didn't spend too much time hanging out or anything, so but it was an education.
I think you'd written that one of the Australians had told you about the desertion rate of soldiers from Arvin, and
Oh
I
yeah,
wonder if
well
that gave you perspective.
I learned some of that over there, and then later on in books and writings that there were a couple of really crack uh, ARVN divisions. I guess the first division, which was a very solid division, and then other ARVN units were not such great soldiers. And some of the guys who were out in the field with joint operations with the ARVN soldiers would say, yeah, there were folks who are not really great soldiers. And but of course, I remember that one of the things I learned from a hooch maid was that her husband had been in the military in South Vietnam for about 15 or 20 years, and I think maybe I'm not sure if he fought against the French, but
Hmm.
it was one of these
Wow.
things where they've been fighting for a long time. So many of them were just sick of it. They did have some certain amount of desertion rate that was higher than the Americans, and they from reading books later on, I learned that some of their commanders became commanders based upon their political connections within the government. Rather than being really trained military people, they were put in a spot because of their political connections.
Mhm. Before moving forward, could we just move backward a little bit? I'm wondering, like, what it was like being on the fire support base buttons outside of Song Bay, being, in a more exposed area.
Well, okay, that's a good point because as opposed to our just walking across the base in Phuc Vin, not having to have our helmet or flak jacket or weapon with us up at Song Bay. Anytime you went outside of your tent, you had to be wearing a flak jacket, have a helmet,
Hmm.
and have an M16. So we'd have to go line up at the mess hall whenever there, and we'd line up ready to if we got attacked. And it was an area that was not it was very close to the Cambodian border, so there were North Vietnamese, and the Viet Cong who were moving back and forth through the
Ho Chi
Ho
Minh.
Chi Minh Trail and the other areas there that could attack. And luckily, I was on at Song Bay at a point when they were not getting attacked, but there were some guys I talked to up there who had been in basically base attacks, and they were defending the base. And so they'd have to wouldn't have great guard towers. They just have the concertina wire out at the edge of the base, and you were just on your own. It was a much smaller base.
Yeah, yeah. So when did you know that you would be leaving Vietnam?
All right, I learned basically I think around it was around mid March that I had already known based upon what was the date expected date expected return from overseas with DRO state would be 1 year after I got there. So I got there June 3rd. I'd be leaving June 3rd, June 2nd, whatever. And so around March, what happened was these orders came through that said, okay, instead of leaving June 3rd, you're going to leave May 25th, let's say. All right, so I just looked at them, said, okay, I'll be here till May 25th. So I'd write my parents, say, well, my latest orders say I'm going to be coming home a week early, week and a half early. And in diverting back to the writings, I was able to write my parents
Yeah.
almost every day because I had access to a typewriter, and I'd number the letters starting with the number
Hmm.
100 so that they would read them in order. So I was in communication with them throughout the time, but of course the time span between getting a letter from there to here was 5 or 6 days or more. So I was in communication, and I'd let them know, okay, here's the deal. And then at the same time, I was readying for my R&R, 1 week R&R that I spent in Hong Kong. I had applied in early March. They said, okay, and last week of March, first week of April, you'll go over with the group and have your week of leave and then come back, and I'd have X time. Well, then just about a week and a half before I left for R&R, I got some orders that said, well, instead of May 25th, you're going to be leaving country April 28th.
getting
Yeah,
better.
well, it's getting better. It's getting better. I said, oh, that's great. That's a deal. I like that. So I went on my R&R, and at the same time I went on my R&R, the first cav was moving out of Phuc Vinh as a headquarters camp.
Mm.
They were dispersing guys who were in two brigades. Couple of brigades were coming home, and guys who didn't have enough time with the division would be assigned other divisions, other units,
Mm.
and they'd pull back to Benoit. So I was basically in Benoit for probably, well, no, I didn't. I didn't get Benoit until after my R&R. My R&R ended, I'll say, just round numbers, April 7th.
Mm-hmm.
Got back from Hong Kong, went through the Tan Son Nhut down in Saigon, got up to the Benoit to where we were stationed, and I was basically living in the back of our little shop. We didn't have really permanent
Yeah.
barracks, assigned barracks that by then, and so I'm just sitting around, just jawing with the guys, and one of the guys said, "Well, Mason, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I'm not leaving till April 25th, X, whatever it was, so I got a few more weeks to hang out here." He
Yeah.
said, "Oh no, we got new orders for you. So you can get out of here as early as April 11th. Well, what the provision, because they were drawing down troops, what had happened while I was permanent party at Fort Dix was that guys who had more than 6 months left to serve
Mm.
in their 2-year commitment, they would be assigned back to the states, and they'd go onto these posts. Number one, they wouldn't be saluting junior officers because they'd already been over in the jungle and didn't have to do that over there. Secondly, there was no place for them, no real job for them because
Huh.
all the slots were filled with permanent party.
Right.
So what the service did was they said, okay, for you 2-year guys, if you've been over here a year or more, what you can do is you can extend your service by X number of days or a couple of weeks until you hit 6 months before your normal estimated term of service, your 2-year date,
Right.
and you can leave and get discharged. And you
Oh.
have to judge it very closely so that you don't land in the States a day early, because what happens is, because you're crossing the international date line, you leave there on
Yeah.
a Thursday, you get back here on a Wednesday, and if you miss the date wrong, then you're going to get assigned somewhere else. And
Wow.
people don't want that. Now, for the rest of us, if we have served less than a year, I think it was, if we had served over 10 months in the war zone and we had fewer than 5 months to serve, and because I came in the service September the 8th, my 2 years would be up September the 7th, and going back 150 days would be April 11th. So they said, hey, these new
Oh.
orders are in, you can
Oh.
get out of the service,
Yeah.
don't have to go back to a stateside post. So I hustled myself up and started out processing. Finally got down to Long Bin to the 90th Replacement Depot, where they had people coming in and out of country. And I finally got out on a flight April 15th. And while we were waiting down there, uh, they had flights going out anytime, day or night. And what you do is you'd be assigned a number. And let's say my number was 415. I don't know what it was,
Mm-hmm.
but every about 3 hours, day or night, they'd call everybody together and say, okay, here are the numbers that are going on the flight back to the States. And you had to be there if your number was called, name was called. And if you didn't say here, then you'd go back to the end of the line. You might wait
Oh.
another 3 days to get a flight out. So we
Yeah.
stayed pretty alert for 2 or 3 days. Didn't sleep a lot, but hey, it was all worth it. And then
Yeah.
they finally, they finally got us out of there. But on that short time I was down in Benoit, uh, I did meet a couple of guys I got drafted with, a couple of guys from
Oh.
Buffalo. One was actually in a finance office there.
Oh.
Another was on his way home in March because he'd served a full year as an infantryman. He was a mortarman. So he ended up getting a 6-month drop. He came back to Buffalo. And then I'm trying to think if I don't think I met any others, but it was interesting just seeing guys who I'd gotten drafted with, went through basic with, and what had happened to them. Because again, they all split. Now, the other interesting moment well, down in Benoit, was that I was striding across, probably going to out process or something. I was looking purposeful and had my head up, straight posture and everything. And all of a sudden, like a guy comes toward me and says, "Afternoon, sir." I said, "Okay, afternoon." He was a captain. He thought I was a major or somebody, some higher level officer. I looked like I wasn't just kind of ambling along.
Around, right, very purposefully.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So those things happen, but we had yeah, and guys were coming into the Cav at that time. As many certain ones were going home, others were being reassigned from other divisions. They had not had enough time in country to go home, so there was a lot of mix and match of people coming and going. So
Yeah.
it was interesting time.
You'd mentioned that you'd written a lot of letters and you had access to the typewriter. I
Yeah.
think you also mentioned that there was a MARS, like the Military Auxiliary Radio call.
Yes, yes. I made one call. That was, I think, in early March before I left Fukvin. I was able to make one call home for about 3 minutes, and that was it. So um, I, I suppose I could have applied for other calls, but at that time, you had to be in country so many months, and you had to get yourself on a list and apply for a call to go overseas. And luckily, because we had enough written communication between myself and my parents that we kept each other informed as to what was going on. So there wasn't much. I think the only thing we discussed in that 3 minute call was going over her wish list of what she'd like me to bring back from Vietnam and kind of jewelry or something,
Right.
something for the house.
It's kind of funny. Um, did you were you open and frank in your letters to your
Well,
parents?
as much as I could be. I really
Yeah.
didn't mention the mortar or rocket attacks because I didn't want them to get too concerned about that. And because they were older, I was concerned that they might have a medical emergency if they found out some negative information. And uh, one thing happened during the time that I was over in Vietnam that I didn't realize until much later when my mom and I talked about it was that while I was over there, there was one time she was coming back, driving back from the grocery store, and she was near the end of the street, ready to turn onto the street we lived, and she saw this big black sedan going slowly down our block. And
God.
her thought immediately was, holy cow, this might be a chaplain and an Army officer who's coming to alert me that, hey, by the way, your son was killed in action. Um, but luckily, she drove several blocks way around, and when she came back, that vehicle had gone. So the fact it was going slowly down the street, it was a big black
Yeah.
sedan, and she was. I didn't realize until then, and much later, how much my parents and sister were concerned about my welfare and how it affected people back here. We were just focused on our job, doing our work, and we'd try to send positive stuff back to the U.S. But then on the nightly news, they'd say, okay, there was a surprise attack on this base or in this
Yeah.
location, and they're always wondering what's happening. And of course, because of the delay in getting letters, that there were um, soldiers, Marines, etc., who would write a letter home on Thursday. Then on Sunday or Monday, their parents would get informed by the service that their
Oh
son
God.
had been killed in action, and then they'd get the
Oh.
last letter another 3 or 4 or 5 days later. Whereas
Yeah.
now the instantaneous communication between here, Iraq, Afghanistan, or wherever people are stationed via the internet, it's a different story.
Yeah. That way it's easier. Yeah.
It is.
So so you're talking before about what it was like coming back to the United States. I think you even mentioned some people would throw their uniforms into the garbage can once they
Yeah.
reached the San
Well,
Francisco
that was because,
civilian
of course,
airport.
that was a hotbed of radicalism,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
we were we came back, flew back, basically almost the same route we came over,
Hmm.
and were spent about a day, day and a half at the Oakland Army Terminal where they'd provide all the discharge papers, the out processing. We'd hand in all of our other uniforms. We'd get, in fact, we came over in, I think it was khakis. We were issued khaki uniforms from Vietnam
Mm.
for the flight over. And then what happened was, while we were out processing, they would make us up a set of dress greens with all of the
Oh.
medals that we had earned, the awards we'd earned, and that's that dress green uniform. So we were there for about a day, day and a half. We got, I think, a steak dinner as our reward for surviving a year. And then they took us on a bus to the San Francisco airport, where at that point, soldiers as well as college students, and I'd done it several years before, could get on half-price standby flights. So what they would do is you'd show up at the counter, get your ticket, your half-price ticket, and then go into the men's room and change out of your uniform, change into civilian clothes. And so most of the guys did change into civilian clothes and then come back out, get on their flight. Other guys, though, and I did see this one guy, I saw one where he just dumped his uniform into the garbage and said, I
Mm.
don't want to ever think about this again. And
Mm.
it was really sad how uh, luckily I was not involved, whereas some other soldiers were involved in the middle of protests of the radicals out on the West Coast. And of all places to have us get discharged from was Oakland Army Terminal and San Francisco Airport. Whereas some guys, if they got discharged out at Fort Dix, or let's say they got discharged at some other military base in the U.S. where there wasn't a hotbed of
Yeah.
radicalism at that time and protesters. So, but it was, and as far as my coming home, I did not take a direct flight from San Francisco to Chicago to Buffalo. I went from San Francisco to Kansas City. I visited some of my Kansas cousins there, and I think I utilized all 10 days on my temporary military pass
Mm-hmm.
to get on these half fare flights. So I ended up going, and I don't know the exact uh, sequence, but I ended up in Kansas City. I went to see my aunt and I think my grandmother in Nashville. I visited somebody else in
Huh.
Morristown, Tennessee. I
Wow.
went to down to Durham to Duke to see some old friends I knew in college, some who had stayed around the area. Then I traveled up to Washington, D.C. There was a buddy of mine from college whose father put me up. He and his mom and dad put me up for a night there, and I visited an old classmate, a girl I known back at Duke, and I talked with this gentleman who was a high level official in the State Department whose son was adamant against the war, and he said to me,
Mm.
well, if my son ever decided to go to Canada, I'd disown him. So there was a lot of that between the generations of the World War II generation that said, you serve, period, and the people
Yeah.
who would want to or not. And then the final stop before I got to Buffalo was up to the Newark, New Jersey area, which was the hometown of where my uh, buddy from college had passed
Oh.
away. And I was hoping to meet his parents there, but they weren't available. So then I came to Buffalo. I got off the plane 10 days after I got discharged. So I used my whole 10 days of this free pass to visit relatives, friends, other people. And generally the reception was pretty good from all the people I visited. And my parents were glad to see me at the airport. And luckily in Buffalo was not, because it was generally say a more conservative area. There weren't people with signs
Yeah.
meeting me at the airport, whereas in some other locations there were. So it was just okay.
Um, did you find that it helped you to decompress a little bit, visiting various family and friends
Slightly,
before returning home?
well, it was slightly, but still, given that I only had a few days and I really wasn't in the company of other military veterans,
Yeah.
that it was still like it was okay. This is kind of a dream or something,
Yeah.
and it happened to other people that were they were in the, especially for frontline infantry people, they would go from their LZ to a base camp. They'd get out of country in 24 to 48 hours. They'd be over in the U.S. another 48 hours, And in a 3 day span, they'd go from fighting the enemy over in
Jeez.
halfway around the world to being back in their hometown or city and trying to adjust. And that's why the guys, I think, who were in the permanent party at Fort Dix or were career folks, because they would be going back, be among the company of their peers and others who'd served in the military and could ease their way into civilian life. But it took a little while, and I guess the bigger factor was that when I got back to Buffalo, um, I did I did connect with a guy who was a buddy in high school who had gone into become a chopper pilot over in Vietnam. I think he was chopper pilot in there in the
Hmm.
67, 68, 69 time frame. He was in some pretty heavy action. And then another guy who I mentioned who went into the Air Force for 4 years, he got out about the same time I did. So we hung around a little bit together. We went to a local tavern, and then the guy who was the chopper pilot, he and he and I went on to an exercise and, for me, a diet program, because because of my nerves over there, I
Yeah.
tended to eat a lot, maybe drank a little more beer. I put on about 30 or 40 pounds. And then when I got back to States, I decided, okay, I've got to get back into
Get rid of
shape, get rid of it. Yeah. So I worked on that.
that. Wow. Wow. Um, but you mentioned something. Well, there's two questions. One of them was I was curious as to whether you wore your uniform when you were in the San Francisco airport
No, I worked to get my ticket, but
ticket.
then after that I changed
Changed
into
it. Yeah.
civilian clothes. But then at the other airports where I had to show up to get a ticket, I would wear my uniform there, and I was able to wear my uniform in front of my relatives and
Yeah.
on the way to visit my friends at Duke, and then I'd change into civilian clothes. So
Yeah.
I didn't make it a big point to parade around in the uniform. I was just in it to, you know, do what I have to
What to
do, get
do?
from one place to another, and that was it. So
Yeah. Um, and you mentioned there's something that surprised me a little bit was that I think when you returned to Buffalo, like there was the World War II veterans were very unreceptive.
right, yes,
Like,
they were not really um, receptive in inviting me to the VFW or American Legion posts, where I thought, well, these are all World War II veterans. They built their houses on the block in the late 40s with GI Bills, so I thought, well, they'd be at least somewhat friendly to me. And while they weren't outwardly
yeah.
hostile, they weren't really supportive. But the one man who was supportive, he ran across the street. He was an older fella,
Hmm.
and he said, Mason, I'd like you to consider joining my American Legion, VFW post, whatever. Well, he was a World War I veteran, which was really interesting that somebody
Yeah.
who was
Yeah.
World War I veteran would say, oh, you served. I don't care what the war was about. I think
Yeah.
you made it through, so welcome home. And the rest of the folks, it just seemed were, just really not that supportive. So I
Hmm.
felt a little taken aback and maybe slightly depressed, or
Yeah.
not feeling, well, what's wrong with me. It was nothing wrong with
Yeah.
me. It's just
Yeah.
the populace at that time could not separate the war from the warrior. And whereas 30 years later, with Desert Storm and other actions, they decide, well, we might not support the war, but we're not going to take it out on the guy who's being sent over by the
Yeah.
commander in chief and the military and political leaders. So,
So,
yeah,
you know,
yeah.
yeah. Was your own family supportive
Oh, sure.
of you?
Yeah, they were
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
supportive. They
Yeah.
were perfectly supportive. And um, in fact, I'm trying to think if that summer, I think, I'm trying to think if that summer I went back to work in the factory where my father was a sales executive. I don't think I did. I think what happened was after I got out that summer, I started looking around for work. Now, Buffalo, as an industrial city,
Mm.
it was the steel industry was going away. The auto industry it wasn't shutting down, but it was decreasing. Some of the major manufacturing was leaving the area, and so I didn't have too many job prospects. So what I did was I spent some time going up to the University of Buffalo Library, and they
Mm.
had out of town newspapers. And I looked through these out of town newspapers everything from New York City to Boston to Dallas, Kansas City,
Wow.
Atlanta, Los Angeles, Denver, all over the
Right.
U.S. and see, well, what kind of jobs are there out there? So I, not finding much luck around. I went maybe on a couple of interviews in the Buffalo area, but nothing panned out. So I looked at these ads and I saw in the Chicago Tribune there were 6 or 7 pages of these accounting and finance ads. Say,
Wow.
wow, this is a gold mine.
Okay.
So what happened was I took a short 3, 4 day trip here to Chicago in August of '71, talked to a couple of job recruiters, etc., and said, hey, I think I'd like to relocate here. Now, there was also another factor that got me interested in moving to Chicago from Buffalo, and that was that my father, during his time working for Worthington Corporation in Buffalo, a major power engine and compressor manufacturer, he would
Mm.
travel to Chicago on business trips. And every
Oh.
time he came back, us little kids will say, so tell us about Chicago. And he told us about the great city it was. And he, in fact, had lived here in the
Oh.
I think, 20s or early 30s. He had lived in
Wow.
Chicago.
Wow.
So he knew a little bit about the area. And so uh, on Thanksgiving weekend of 1971, I was sitting down with my parents and we were just, I don't know if it was Thanksgiving dinner. I think it was Thanksgiving dinner. And I invited my buddy, the chopper pilot, over for the dinner. He didn't have anywhere really to go. So we had dinner with my parents, my sister. And I said, oh, by the way, I'm leaving for Chicago this weekend, going there to find work. And I mean,
Mm.
they weren't totally surprised. They knew that sooner or later I'd be probably leaving, going elsewhere. And many of my fellow classmates from high school and guys I knew from the street who'd gone to different colleges, they took off to various and sundry places. So, um, I
Were you considering at that point going back to school?
well, I had sort of gotten away from the idea of going back to school. What oddly enough happened was that sometime either late senior year of my college or sometime when I was in the service, I applied. Well, I applied to a couple of those schools that I visited during my leave before going to Vietnam. I didn't get into those schools, which was like University of Chicago, Michigan, Penn. They're really good, great,
Yeah.
not good, great,
Right. Right.
great,
Right.
great MBA schools. But I did get admitted, I think, to University of Texas and maybe Penn
Mm.
State. But
Wow.
then I was sort of, I wasn't really in the mind to go back into studying at
Yeah.
that point. It was kind of too soon after I was out of the service, and I didn't know quite how I'd support myself while I was going to school, et cetera, et cetera. And
Yeah.
at that time, the GI Bill, instead of providing the tuition and some living expenses to any school in the U.S., which is what World War II veterans got, we got a certain stipend per month, and anything
Oh,
over and above that that it costs to go to school or living, you're responsible for. So
big
I
difference.
couldn't really use my GI Bill benefits. I didn't think I could use them at that time. So I said, well, I'll go look for work, and I got into Chicago and Sunday of Thanksgiving weekend, and then I finally landed a job that I started in February of
Wow.
'72. So
So
that's that worked
it
out.
worked out well. Yeah. Um, so had you been involved in veteran organizations? I mean, I know we talked about the early attempts, but it seemed
Right.
like later on you
Okay.
had
Well,
interest.
I would say okay. I didn't join the VFW American Legion as my World War One veteran suggested. However, when I got after I got to Chicago, they had several veterans organizations here. One of which was the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and
Mm.
that was some uh, former student protesters who had maybe gone into the army services, become disillusioned with the war. And I went to maybe one meeting or one gathering, and I sort of didn't get a real good feeling for it. And so I learned later and that they were really being infiltrated by a bunch of socialist Marxist
Oh,
type, almost
yeah.
communist group. They were subversives. And then later on, what happened was the Vietnam Veterans of America formed and became a big organization that was a positive organization
Hmm.
that said,
Hmm.
okay, we don't take a political stand on the war. We just welcome you veterans back. Now, I did, when I was working in the Norfolk, Virginia Beach area in the early 80s, I did join a VVA chapter there,
Hmm.
marched in a couple of their parades. They were primarily Navy veterans because, of course, Norfolk was a huge Navy base, etc. And I didn't get very active, and it wasn't until really I got back into Chicago in the 90s that I even considered joining anything, and that was the early 2000s. And the way I joined the First Cabs chapter locally here was because I had met a guy at a Toastmasters meeting
Huh.
who had served in the cab. Now, what was interesting about this guy,
Yeah.
Tom, was he was based at Benoit in personnel in processing at the same time I was processing in country
Oh,
30
wow.
some years before. So there's a possibility that he might have processed some of my forms. And of course, I wouldn't remember him because of, you're just going through this faceless, nameless group
Yeah.
of people getting in country, doing this, doing that. And so he introduced me to the Sheridan's Cavalry chapter. And
Oh.
that's how I ended up getting together with this group of guys here. And I decided to align myself with the unit that I had served with in Vietnam versus the American Legion or VFW because they really were not interested in having Vietnam veterans in their organizations in the 70s. But the irony was that 30 plus years later, they would send me these big certificates that say, we really appreciate your service to this country because basically their World War II veterans were dying out. So they needed new
Yeah.
new
Members.
members. So so I said, thanks, but no
No
thanks.
thanks.
If you'd gone ahead and done this maybe 30 years ago and welcomed me in, I might have considered it. But many of us, I would have to say, because of the sentiment of the country still in the early 70s, divided on the war uh, politically, that we didn't want to talk very much about our service except to other
Yeah.
veterans.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of people who never even knew that I was in the
Wow.
military. They just knew, well, Mason's here at this job, he's doing this job. He went to college somewhere and he's here now and no big deal. Now, I finally did end up, because my career was with defense contractors, we had a lot of military veterans, including career officers and career enlisted,
Hmm.
who
Hmm.
were mid to high level officers and enlisted, who some of whom served in Vietnam, and they respected my service and I respected them. And they sort of gave me a little bit of an ego boost that, okay, I served honorably, even though I was in a support role, like one of the guys who was a company commander and a platoon leader in Vietnam, served there two different times. You said, well, you were at the circus and you saw the elephants. So that was the
Yeah.
sort of,
Feel.
see, that was the idea that, hey, you weren't maybe in the middle of it, but you were there and you were in danger. So you did your thing.
They appreciated
They
it.
appreciated it. And
Yeah.
I learned, uh, I guess I really compatible with these guys. And I was, after a while, even though I left the service as an E4 Spec 4, even though these guys were lieutenant colonels, colonels, and in fact, I worked for a two-star retired general. So that we would treat each other as equals, or they'd be a superior, I'd be a subordinate, and it was really interesting to see their
Yeah.
perspective on things.
Well, so yeah, that it sounds like it could be very helpful.
Oh yeah, it
Just
was. Yeah, it was. Just
personally.
personally, it was
Yeah.
helpful, and it provided me. And I think probably the lady I married, my wife at the time, didn't know very much about my military background. It was only later she found out about what my military service was because um, her father, I guess, was in the military, and he died early because he had been a witness to some atomic blasts outside Las
Oh.
Vegas in the Nevada
Yeah.
desert. So
Yeah.
might have gotten sick from uh,
Radiation.
radiation and died at an early age. So she, but I really didn't spend a lot of time with veterans organizations until the last, I'll say, 15 years from 2003 onward. So
Do you think it meant something to knowing that your wife had this military background that she thought it was something she would appreciate in
it didn't really come up in
yeah,
conversation or
yeah,
as a
yeah.
thing. But then after I got divorced, I met a lady who I'm now with, Vivian, who had two sons, has two sons who are in the military. One who was both in the Marines and the Army, the other who was a Marine.
Wow.
She sort of appreciated my service more than other people might, and
Yeah,
so
yeah,
that's just
yeah. So, what does citizen soldier mean to you?
well. Uh, it basically means that what we do is in this country, you have a duty to your country as part of patriotism to support the values and goals. And if called for the military, you go unless you have some overriding reason why you aren't aren't able to physically, mentally, psychologically, etc. And then what you do is you serve your country for a period of time, then go back to your civilian pursuits and move along with your life. And as such, I'm a proponent of what would be called some kind of national service. Since the ending of the draft, I see this separation between the military population, many of whom have relatives who have been in the military, and that they then have their sons, daughters, relatives go in the military, and there's not a wide dispersion of people who are affected by the military and are involved with it. So I'd like to see that, number one, we have some kind of national service. And it doesn't have to be military service. It could be working in a hospital, it could be working, doing something else on the infrastructure, just so people could develop some sort of patriotism.
Mm.
And then the other thing I'm a little bit concerned about is that in the military today, for people who are just entering the military, they are given these front end bonuses. And so while they may be incentivized by, okay, the post military benefits, the fact that you get medical care in the military and you're trained for a job, that if you get money up front, it more becomes a mercenary
Hmm.
group. There's some mercenary ideas in there versus the people who, when I was in the service, they'd serve 3, 4, X number of years, then they get a reenlistment bonus as an incentive to serve more time after they've already proved themselves. But getting money up front, I'm not real big proponent of that.
I do find it interesting that you're comparing it to almost like a mercenary situation.
Yeah,
I was
yeah, and
interested.
I
Yeah,
I see some elements of that, and
yeah.
just as people are going in, I think, for the wrong reason. Some people are going in for the wrong reasons. Some are going for the right reasons. And as I talk to people who are going in, is that it seems like more often than not they have had relatives who had been in the service, been on active duty, and um, so they're following and different areas of the country. I know that even when I went in the service, the big urban areas up north, a lot of people wanted to avoid the service, whereas down south and out in the rural areas, military service was revered and respected. Whereas up in the north, it was, or in a large city, it was, well, if you can't get any other job, you go in the military, or you're a sucker if you can't find a way to get out of it. So the big irony is that for all those people who found ways to slip through the cracks, get out of it during the 60s, now they're saying, oh, gee, I'm sort of, I feel bad that I didn't go in the service and all this. They have this guilt, and I think that is one of the sources of all the free meals and the goodies that some of the veterans are getting now. Is people feel guilty about how they treated them back
Back
then.
then, it's sort of come full
Full
circle.
circle, yeah, and the ingenious ways people were trying to get out of the service. I think of two instances that are really come to mind. The one that while I was in the service, this was interesting. As permanent party, I would have frequent, say, I'd have some guard duty. Well, during Christmas of 19 '69, soon after, just a second.
Sure.
Soon after I was assigned permanent party at Fort Dix, we had a choice of having a 7-day leave either around Christmas or around New Year's. Well, I selected the 7 days around New Year's to go visit my parents and friends in Buffalo. So during Christmas Day in the previous 24 hours, I was on some 24 to 36-hour guard duty. I was walking around this empty classroom building in the snow and slush at Fort Dix, New Jersey. It was hardly a strategic asset there. It wasn't a weapons room or storage area or anything like that. They didn't have strategic secrets in there. So I was tramping around, and uh, that was one guard duty. And another guard duty I remember very specifically was I was walking around a parking lot with another trooper, and I met a guy who had graduated actually from Duke a year before I did, and he got drafted. And what he did was he went over to the base library. He was looking up the military regulations, and he found out that if he could just stay under the radar and spend a certain amount of time in his E1 grade without getting promoted, if he didn't get promoted in X number of months, as the military normally did, if you kept your nose clean, you could request a discharge. So he went and researched all this and tried to just keep low profile, not be too visible to anybody. I don't know if he ever got out that way, but that was one way that just unusual. And then the other was that back after I got out of the service, I went back to Duke, and I happened to see the guy who was my freshman roommate. And he was married and living nearby. And I said, "So Steve, how come you never served or got inducted or anything or went for a draft physical?" He said, "Well, I'll tell you what, Mason." Again, he went to the military regulations and found that if for his height, which was, let's say, 5'10", he weighed 150 pounds normally when he was in school. He said for his height, if he starved himself down below 120 pounds, he would fail an Army physical. So he went, his wife helped to get him on this huge diet. He starved himself down to 115 pounds, failed a physical. Then he went back 6 months later, failed a second physical, and said, "You're out." So, I mean, there were all kinds of ways that there were creative ways people were trying to get out of the service, and versus, just saying, well, okay, if they take me, they take me.
And what is like a moment of which you're most proud? Or if not a moment, just in general, what's a source of pride?
Well, a source of pride is that I served my country. I was in a support position. I was in, and what's now makes me more proud now was the guys I served with were in a unit that is heralded as one of the elite divisions of the U.S. Army. And I the other source of pride is that I I feel like I want to give back to the current generations of soldiers and not have them go through the reception coming back to states that I got when they go and they serve in a foreign country, hostile area. And just being around guys who um, really understand what their time in country was like versus my time. Because again, I was a support troop. Many of these were infantry, some were artillery, some were Army, chopper pilots, etc. And listening to their stories, and of course reading the accounts of the various books. And I have a little listing, and I'll send it to you later, of some of the books. I've not read all of these in their entirety, but I've read parts of these books, everything from about the Tet Offensive to We Were Soldiers Once and Young to a book that was on the soundtrack of the Vietnam War. And the book's title is "We Got to Get Out of This Place," which was a big song in the late '60s, and that was one song. And then of course, San Francisco by Scott McKenzie and the others. That just getting the overall view of that time and complementing the books were the various either public TV or other documentaries. And I saw the Stanley Carnow Vietnam in the 80s, early 80s. Also the Ken Burns documentary, multi-part documentary. But one of the things that documentaries don't do that some of the veterans are concerned about
Mm-hmm.
is while they talk about some of the actions on our side of civilian deaths, burning down huges, etc., they don't talk about the enemy covering up a lot of their atrocities that
Yeah.
you don't really hear very much about. And I hate to say it, that some of the documentarians are of a liberal bent, and they were the types who were the protesters in the 60s, so they want to kind of put a negative spin on what the warriors and people were doing. And of course, it is an overwhelming the overwhelming um, parts of these documentaries have to do with the war fighters, and they only have a little bit about what the folks who were in the support roles did, and there were 5 of us for every frontline individual. So that's one of the reasons I thought it was important to tell my story. At first, I didn't think, well, I really haven't done that much because I wasn't in a line unit. I didn't go out there in the bush and get into firefights, but I also supported the troops in another way. And I'm proud that I supported the troops in that other way.
Very much so. And it's like we need everybody.
Yeah, we were all in it together. And
Yeah, you know.
it, the thought was that for many years that, oh, well, I wasn't really that important. I just did my duty and I came back, and I was lucky enough to work in a field in which I was trained. But in reality, hey, I did add to the war effort.
And then, in a
Risky environment.
environment.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, I
yeah,
did, yeah.
yeah. Is there anything that you would like to talk about that we did not address right
Oh,
now?
boy.
I don't know. I'm so thinking, like, what's the can't ask question?
Oh, boy. Well, okay. My views over the years about the enemy have somewhat changed. I know that was one of the questions,
Yeah.
and that was one of the supplemental things I went into, is that as I read more, learned more from documentaries, I learned about the different aspects of the war that were not only involving the U.S. and, let's say, the NVA, Viet Cong, the various political military issues, both from their side and our side, and what has been um, broadcast only in the last probably decade or 2 decades have been some of the private conversations of LBJ, McNamara, Richard Nixon, the other leaders, and how what they told the American public versus how they really thought and felt about the whole war effort. And then I would really like to read, and I know about the book Robert McNamara's The Fog of War, and how that during the later stages of his time as Secretary of Defense that he was wondering, well, where is this all going, but couldn't say it publicly, as other people couldn't say it publicly. And one of the things from one of the documentaries that came out and struck me was when Clark Clifford was on one of these programs and said, well, I got into office after Robert McNamara left, and I sat around with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I asked them the simple question, what's your strategy for winning the war? And he said, these guys didn't have a reply. They'd say, well, we're making progress here, we're making progress there, we're doing this, we're doing that. And it was, wait a second, you're either going to win the war or why are you there? And there, the thing was that the military and the upper levels of the military and the politicians, they were in so deep that it was difficult to just so-called, what Nixon said, you can't cut and run.
Yeah.
You peace through honor, peace through strength or through honor, um, and all of that. And all of the contradictions between what the leaders were telling and what they were really thinking. Now, also the other thing that uh, bothered me and many other veterans was that we really didn't lose the war. We were on the side that lost the war. We quit supporting our ally. And in fact, I suggest we were not, quote, losers. We just happened to be aligned with the group that lost. The other thing was that as I was viewing uh, the programs during the time I was going to college, even then, I wondered, well, what really happened at the Gulf of Tonkin? Why would we be surprised by a uh, the Tet Offensive when, in fact, Westmoreland and others were saying, well, we've turned the corner, we are killing them faster than they can replace themselves, and it just seemed like we didn't really have a grasp on the history, the culture, uh, what these countries had gone through over not previous years or decades, but centuries, because over a period of centuries, Vietnam had been invaded by and had repelled colonial powers. They repelled the Chinese, the Japanese, the French, and we never even thought about it. We thought in Western terms that, okay, if we install what we think is a Western style democracy, which when we were supporting Diem and his group, they were a corrupt group of so called South Vietnamese nationalists, whereas the North was very dedicated to rejoining the country, even though it was on communist terms. And of course, with as we had talked about, the domino theory, the idea that once Vietnam went communist, then everything else would
Follow suit.
fall like dominoes. And I got a more respect for really what our enemy had gone through. There was one book by James Zumwalt, the brother of Elmo Zumwalt III, and the son of Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, who did order the Agent Orange spraying, and his son Elmo died of Agent Orange at age 42. James Zumwalt, his brother, wrote a book, Bare Feet, Iron Will, where he went over and he interviewed a lot of those people who were NVA, VC, who had worked on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the dedication that they had. And this was also supported by a lot of our soldiers that said the other side was very well trained. They were very good soldiers and they knew what they were doing. They were very tough soldiers. We might have downgraded them by calling them gooks or zips or whatever, but that we really respected their fighting and realized the sacrifices they made, as in this book, Bare Feet, Iron Will, that the North Vietnamese Army Museum had a listing of mothers who had lost 3 or more sons, and some of them had lost 4 or 5 male members of their family, everything from a husband to brother to sons to could have been a daughter who was working on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And there were a lot of women involved in the war, as well as men. And just the fact that they were not going to they would do whatever it took to win the war, whether it took 2 years or 20 years. And they were accustomed to a longer time frame. We in the U.S. are always accustomed to winning a war 3, 4 years max.
Yeah.
And now that Afghanistan and Iraq has been going on, especially Afghanistan has been going on since 2001, we're in our 17th or 18th year of military action there. What's going to happen with that? It just seems like we haven't learned the lessons. And while I'd say I'm pro-democracy and anti-communist, that some of these societies really are not ready for a Western-style democracy, as the fact that about 20% of the population, the high military and political leaders in Vietnam, were Catholic. They were educated in France. They were aligned with the French, and the rest of the country is Buddhist. A little rice farmer out in the you know out in his
Yeah.
fields doesn't care really who's in power. So you know
Right, right. The ideology doesn't affect them.
it doesn't
Yeah.
affect them. Yeah, they just want to be left alone. And unfortunately, they were whipsawed by both sides, both us and the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong would come in and draft, or I mean, the North Vietnamese would come in and draft these villagers, the sons of the villagers, and they'd take them away and you're going to fight for us, whether you like it or not, or we're going to kill your family. Well, what are they going to do?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they also they killed village chiefs who were sympathetic um, to the Saigon regime. And of course, they also, even before we were heavily involved, I saw on TV the protests by the young Buddhist monks in Saigon, and the ones who self-immolated. You see
Yeah.
the picture of the self-immolation of the Buddhists protesting, and the uh, the Saigon government, in some respects, was as heavy-handed and
Yeah.
discriminatory against the Buddhist monks as the communists hated the, democratic leaders.
Yes, yeah. Mm.
Trying to think of other thoughts that come to
That's
mind.
good.
It's been
It-
a long period of, from time to time, introspection, and probably the last 2 or 3 years since the last interview I had, that all these thoughts came up, and I of course recorded a lot of stuff that I
It's good.
remembered and came up with. And I have tried to get in contact with a couple of guys I knew back in Vietnam. I reached out to several of them
Mm.
who I found out through internet white pages, etc., to come to the 1st Cav Division's reunion in 2014, but they didn't
Oh.
really respond. And I I did meet a couple of guys. One, in fact, the guy who was wounded in the mortar attack, his family lived in Washington, D.C. I was there for a business trip. I stopped by and had dinner with him, although I don't really respect him because of the fact he had signed up for, gotten a scholarship his last 2 years of college, went into service, and then decided he was a conscientious objector when he was assigned to the front. And then the other guy I met, who was the accountant after I was with
Mm.
his gift shop, he and his wife lived up in Minneapolis, and I was on a business trip up
Oh.
there, and I met him one night for a few hours. So I've been in touch, but
Touch.
not on a
Okay.
regular basis. It's not
Yeah.
like a lot of the World War II guys. They tended to, some of them were neighbors. In fact, they'd be
Yeah.
sitting around telling war stories, just like when I was growing up in suburb of Buffalo. The neighbors behind us, these two guys who were World War II vets, would stay up till 2, 3 in the morning. I don't know
Wow.
when they ever got work done, but they'd be staying there drinking their beer or their liquor or whatever, and
Talking.
regaling about their times in the service.
Huh. Well, no, it's all very interesting. And on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, I'd
Oh,
like to thank you
wow.
for,
Thank you very
for
much for
your
this.
time and also, of course, for your service.
Oh, we appreciate that. I appreciate your appreciating me, and thank you for this very fine challenge coin. I'll
Oh,
put this in the front of all my other challenge coins
please.
that I have.
Well,
So
that's cool. That's
thank you.
you're very welcome.